The year is 1971, and the fuselage-era Imperial, produced by Chrysler, is up for a tough year. For 1971, the Imperial will sell just 11,558 units, down from 11,816 in 1970 and 22,077 units in 1969. It would represent the weakest showing for the Imperial in its relatively short-lived history as a standalone division. It would also represent the first year that Chrysler would affix a badge to the rear of the Imperial, declaring that this 1971 version was no longer just the Imperial, but it was now the Imperial by Chrysler. On the outside, Imperial would see a few stylistic changes, mostly grille and body side trim related, for the new model year, but it still had that so-called fuselage-era look, and the Imperial would undergo a more significant revision for the 1972 model year before it would be sunset in the 1973 model year, and a new Imperial would come out for 1974 with a waterfall grille. In 1971, there are a number of new options that buyers could opt for, but first let's turn under hood, where the Imperial's V8 for 1971 made 335 gross horsepower, or 230 net horsepower. This was the first year in which manufacturers published both gross and net horsepower ratings. The latter included the calculation of engine horsepower, where the air cleaner, alternators, accessory drives, and exhausts were part of the rating system, whereas for gross horsepower ratings they were not. Imperial for 71 would offer a number of new features, first of which was a new four-wheel SureBrake anti-lock brake system. This was the first instance of a four-wheel anti-lock system on American cars. Cadillac and Lincoln did have anti-lock brake systems, but they were two-wheel, focused on the rear wheel. And in fact, on Lincoln Mark IV, there was a two-wheel anti-lock brake system as standard equipment. This four-wheel system was optional, and it was developed by Bendix in conjunction with Chrysler. And although it was offered, it didn't prove very popular, selling just under 300 units in 1971. But the real option that many individuals wanted was clearly a Paisley top on their Imperial. For what could be more stylish than driving around in a 127-inch wheelbase, nearly 230-inch long car with something other than a Paisley top? This was something that clearly buyers needed, and for 1971, Chrysler had to introduce this to the buying public, and they were going to do it specifically on one exterior color car to match it, and that was a color that Chrysler had called sparkling burgundy metallic. Of course, I'm being facetious in that nobody really wanted a Paisley top on their Imperial, although during this time period, Chrysler did sell a number of vehicles with a Paisley top, or so-called mod top, in the 1969 and 1970 model years. But it really was not the intent of designers to place that type of a top on the Imperial. Instead, designers were really trying to emulate some fine Italian fabrics and have those be the template, so to speak, for some vinyl roof patterns on the Imperial. It was a great idea to effectively introduce a new top color as well as vinyl top texture to the model lineup in 1971, and it was only available on, as I said, cars that were painted an Imperial-specific exterior color called sparkling burgundy metallic, which, as you can see here, is just a gorgeous color for these Imperials. But designers wanted to have something other than the typical black and white top on the red car, and so they introduced this new pattern. Now, what was interesting about it is that while the burgundy vinyl top looked good when a buyer first procured their Imperial, for whatever reason, the burgundy coloring on these vinyl roofs, and just these in particular, quickly faded to reveal a kind of paisley pattern in the vinyl roof. It was a defect in the material. Now, how did this happen, you'll say? Well, some speculate that Chrysler suppliers just simply had a bunch of leftover mod top vinyl that they didn't know what to do with, since the mod top was no longer available after the 1970 model year. And so they perhaps came up with a brilliant idea to simply dye the vinyl top material a burgundy color, ship it to Chrysler, have it put over top of the Imperials, and call it a day. It's not quite clear what the underlying reason was for these tops fading so quickly, but the fact of the matter is that they certainly did. And as you can see here in the pictures, it was likely not what the owners of these Imperials intended. I mean, it kind of looks silly to see an Imperial with this top, especially with the muted and washed out coloring. As a result, Chrysler recalled these Imperials and allowed the owners to select a new color vinyl roof to put on top of the car instead of this Paisley pattern. And I'm sure many Imperial owners were happy to rid themselves of what was unquestionably a very strange looking top, riding atop their otherwise stately Imperial. But no matter the reason for the top fading, it is perhaps emblematic that it did so on these 1971 Imperials, for the Imperial was becoming less and less of an Imperial and more of a Chrysler over time. In the 1961 model year, Imperial lost its own assembly plant. Then it lost its unique body-on-frame construction after the 1966 model year. And by the way, this body-on-frame construction we'll cover in a future video is one of the most robust, maybe even the most robust in all of automotive history. And it's for that reason that these Imperials were banned from demolition derbies for many, many years. The frames were just so strong. In any case, Imperial switched to unibody for 1967. And then in 1969, when the fuselage-era cars were introduced, the Imperial really lost a unique body. And it had to share many more components with Chrysler's on the exterior as well as the interior versus what it had to do in previous model years. As I mentioned before, the buying public was certainly taking increasingly less notice of the Imperials as sales figures continued to dwindle. And by 1971, Imperial sold just 11,558 units. That mid-cycle refreshing for 1972 would boost sales to 15,794. And in 1973, sales would further increase to 16,729 units. But that would be the second highest sales year behind 1969 for these fuselage-era Imperials, as they never really quite caught on in the marketplace, especially when you compare the sales figures of the Imperial to Cadillac in particular, who was selling hundreds of thousands of vehicles during this time period, or Lincoln, whose Mark IV in 1972 outsold the entire Imperial lineup by about 3.5 to 1. So these were unfortunately sad days for Imperial, especially if you happened to get one in the 1971 color sparkling burgundy metallic with what you thought was going to be a burgundy vinyl roof that quickly turned to Paisley. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the 1971 Imperial and its so-called Paisley mod top. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching.